This is John Maynard Keynes, the British economist. Now, I know what you're thinking. What a stud, am I right? I mean, just look at the scholarly visage, the beefy mustache, and the typical upper-class English look of never having taken a good shit in his life. But those weren't the only reasons everyone was crazy for him. It was really his ideas that made him the most influential economist of the first half of the 20th century. See, Keynes had a problem. He was a capitalist, but at the time he was working, the 1920s and 30s predominantly, capitalism as it existed, well, it didn't look so good. The Great Depression brought with it endless miseries for the working class who were threatening to revolt, and this convinced Keynes that unless the excesses of unrestrained free market capitalism that led to the crisis were reined in, capitalism as a system would collapse and the godless commies would take over the world. Keynes' big idea, put very simply, was that during a recession, government spending was key in bolstering demand in the economy, which would help to get it out of the recession. Rejecting the economic orthodoxy of his time, which stressed on governments maintaining balanced budgets, he suggested governments spend, even if they had to borrow money to do so and run a fiscal deficit. This is what came to be known as deficit spending. This was far from the only contribution he made to economics, but this was the big one. And at the end of the Second World War, it played a crucial role in the reconfiguration of the relationship between the state and private capital. This reconfiguration was necessitated by the realization among policymakers in the leading capitalist countries that a return to a free market system and its accompanying volatility was not desirable either at the domestic or the international level, and that the state would have to intervene in order to stabilize the system, to discipline capital to some extent, and to give labor its due, lest it, facing the brunt of another economic depression, grow even more powerful and restive. What Keynes's work facilitated was something of a makeover for capitalism, or to borrow an analogy from Mark Blyth, the system received a software update. Capitalism 2.0, if you will. And in this version, you saw states setting themselves the target of reining in the side effects of free market capitalism through a variety of measures, like government expenditures to boost employment, by state ownership of industries in important sectors in which profit maximization by private capital has negative social costs, such as utilities, among others, by creating the modern welfare state to ensure a minimal decent standard of living for all, and lastly, by restraining the power of capital to fund the state's development agenda through high taxes, along with restricting the influence of finance capital by imposing controls over its free movement and scope of action. This was the new capitalism, less harsh, less ruthless, and less destructively chaotic. This was the Keynesian consensus, and it was a dominant form of capitalism practiced in the industrially advanced countries following the Second World War. And it worked out pretty great actually, for a long while at least. No joke, the period from 1945 to the early 70s is quite deservedly called the golden age of capitalism in these countries. In France, they even have a name for this period. They call it... wait, I can't pronounce that.
Les 30 Glorieuses.
Yeah, or the Glorious 30, referring to 30 years of spectacular economic growth between 1945 and 1975. And growth in this period was fairly equitable, with the share of the bottom 50% in national income rising, while that of the top 1% falling in the leading industrialized countries during this period. Real wages grew in line with labor productivity, allowing a general improvement in living standards of working people. I don't want to paint too rosy a picture of this period because it was also marked by a massive social upheaval, but from a macroeconomic standpoint, this was pretty much as good as it gets under capitalism at least. Capital was, let's say, uneasy with this arrangement. On the one hand, sections of private capital, notably defense and aerospace, were drowning in public money secured through lucrative government contracts while facing little to no competition, beneficiaries of what has been called military Keynesianism. On the other, finance was essentially caged, and big business had to put up with strong unions, rising wages, high taxes, regulations, things it considered burdens holding it back. But capital, though it wanted to throw these burdens off, lacked the mechanisms to do so effectively. It did not yet have the capacity to challenge Keynesianism at an intellectual level. Neither did it have the credibility to win over policymakers and the public, as the policies it found most favorable were still tainted with memories of the Great Depression. So it did the obvious. It went about slowly building the institutional capacity to attack Keynesianism intellectually, while at the same time building support for its favored ideology among policymakers and to a lesser extent the public. Out of the struggle to overturn the dominance of Keynesianism, Neoliberalism was born. This reactionary onslaught began almost immediately after the end of the Second World War in the late 1940s. by setting up and funding organizations like the Mont Pelerin Society and think tanks like the Foundation for Economic Education, among others, by supporting scholars at bastions of free market ideology such as the University of Chicago, by backing politicians that espoused its views, by using its think tanks to provide lawmakers analysis of legislation, and through myriad other means, capital went about laying the groundwork for overthrowing Keynesianism over the next 2 decades. It bided its time, letting intellectuals reformulate its favored ideology in terms that equated freedom of capital to do as it willed with the freedom of individuals in the marketplace, while its think tank machinery went about nudging policymakers away from the Keynesian consensus. But even as it gained strength over the decades, it could not gain the credibility it required to pose as a viable alternative to Keynesianism. For that, it required Keynesianism to lose its legitimacy, which it did when, starting in the late 60s, the whole post-war economic order got engulfed in a lengthy crisis. Starting in 1968, inflation in industrialized countries began showing signs of an upsurge. Then in 1971, the post-war international monetary system collapsed when Richard Nixon did away with the dollar's convertibility to gold. With the uncertainty surrounding the end of the gold standard came a drastic increase in commodity prices between 1971 and 73, on top of which the Arab-Israeli conflict of 1973 caused a 4-fold increase in the price of oil. Major economies of the world screeched to a halt, inaugurating the era of stagflation, stagnating or even shrinking economies racked by high inflation. The Keynesian consensus was crumbling, and policymakers in the leading capitalist countries, the US and UK in particular, were now more open than ever to accepting alternatives that would help them tide over the crisis they were facing. Capital had succeeded in its task of building an internally coherent intellectual critique of Keynesian policies that had enough perceived academic credibility to be seen as a way out of the crisis. Furthermore, certain sections of the policy-making elite in both countries were personally influenced by the leading proponents of this newly popular ideology, most notably people like Milton Friedman, seen here indicating the total number of times he has ejaculated in his entire life. This sole moment of ecstasy most probably came about when he heard that the socialist government of Salvador Allende in Chile had been overthrown in a CIA-backed coup. It wasn't an overnight switch. Profound changes in the way the world is structured never is. But there was a gradual shift starting in the second half of the 70s under Democrat Jimmy Carter in the US and Jim Callaghan's Labour Party in the UK. Though both these administrations were crucial for normalizing neoliberal ideas to some extent, it was really the rise of Reagan and Thatcher by the end of the 70s that helped to fully crystallize the neoliberal policy package, which finally put to rest the ghost of old John Maynard Keynes. No more were governments dedicated to achieving full employment and improving social outcomes. Their primary task in the new order was to create a conducive environment for investment. An important policy in this regard was giving finance capital the freedom to move as it pleased, along with the deregulation of financial markets, which unleashed what we now call the era of globalization. In the new age of globalized capital, nation-states had to offer all kinds of incentives to attract capital to their shores. So taxes on profits and financial gains had to be cut to increase returns to capital. Governments had to regulate spending and keep deficits in check to retain the confidence of investors. Sectors of the economy which were highly regulated and those out of which capital was kept out entirely were to be opened up for privatization to create new avenues for profits. The power of trade unions had to be undermined to minimize losses due to labor actions and foster an atmosphere of labor flexibility to keep wages in check. Trade barriers had to be removed to open new markets. Environmental regulations had to be relaxed or ignored so as to not hassle capital, and central banks had to be dedicated to fighting inflation to preserve the value of assets. The system of transfer of public money to defense, aerospace, agribusiness and others, however, was to continue unabated. Of course, neoliberal policies were not framed in this way. They were couched in terms of promoting entrepreneurship, increasing efficiency, removing bureaucratic red tape, providing consumer choice and other lofty goals. The real consequences of these policies, however, have been starkly different for different sections of society. For the capitalist class, it has brought unprecedented profits and power. And for the rest, stagnant or declining wages, rising costs of basic and essential services, crumbling welfare, destruction of jobs in agriculture and traditional labor-intensive industries, unrestrained and catastrophic exploitation of the environment and natural resources, increasingly severe economic downturns, and obscene, morally repulsive levels of wealth inequality. The rise of far-right political parties all over the world in recent times can also be traced to the social rot spread by neoliberalism. The events of the last 40 years make it obvious that the neoliberal critique of Keynesianism had little to do with restoring freedom of the individual and was more of a cynical, self-serving reaction against the restraints imposed on capital. But that doesn't mean that Keynesianism was without flaws, or that the only reason it collapsed was that policymakers under the influence of capital departed from its teachings, although that was certainly true. The crisis that discredited Keynesianism and led to the rise of neoliberalism was, at a structural level, built into it. Despite academics and policymakers believing that they had mastered the business cycle and unlocked the secret to perpetual growth with the help of Keynes's ideas, the system carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The US, as the leading capitalist country, had designated its currency, the dollar, as good as gold, which meant you could convert $35 into an ounce of gold. As the war in Vietnam escalated in the late 60s and the US spent massive amounts on setting up military bases around the world, there was a flood of dollars pouring out of the US, which it financed by printing more dollars. The American involvement in the war and the expansion of its military may seem external to the economy, but we have to remember that they were an outcome of US foreign policy that relied on its military might to keep open markets for investment. And furthermore, the American war machine was a crucial conduit to transfer public money into the hands of capital. Anyway, there's a lot of dollars being held by non-Americans, and in the late 60s, inflation started blowing up in the US, partially due to the fact that unions could bargain for more wages, and the rise in wages was then passed on to consumers. This weakened the dollar, and people are like, I might as well convert my dollars to gold before it weakens any further. At this point, the Americans know that the jig is up, that they have printed so many dollars but don't hold the equivalent amount of gold to give to people who are lining up to convert them. So when all this is happening in 1971, Richard Nixon basically goes, yeah, we're not doing the whole dollar gold convertibility thing anymore. And with that, the post-war international monetary system collapsed. The uncertainty that arose out of these developments led to further weakening of the dollar as people moved away from holding dollars to holding commodities. This, along with the hike in the price of oil, caused an explosion in commodity prices, further increasing inflation. Growth slowed down and then turned negative, and unemployment shot up aggressively. The system crashed, and a new software update was administered. A long historical view of the events of the last 100 years shows us the shifting balance of forces between capital, labor, and the state. Capital ruled supreme in the pre-Depression era, with the state facilitating its brutal exploitation of labor. The Great Depression and the Second World War marked a shift in the relationship between the state and capital, as the state sought to exert some measure of discipline over capital to accommodate the growing strength of labor. But even this relatively humane form of capitalism was not without bugs that threw the system into a prolonged crisis, which was exploited by capital to undo the restraints the state had placed on it, so it could go about undermining labor's strength and finally vanquish it. In this light, the era of Keynesianism can be seen as a pause in capital's brutal centuries-long class war, and the neoliberal era as the resumption of open hostilities between capital and labor, with the state firmly on capital's side and assisting it in beating down the working class. The Keynesian phase was thus something of an historical anomaly that came about due to an ideological revolution within capitalism at a time of crisis that recognized its limitations and had a commitment to the system's long-term stability. Humane as it may have been, like all forms of capitalism, it tended towards crisis and decay. The victory of the neoliberals also came about during a crisis when they led an ideological coup of sorts. Their intellectual foundations were and still are extremely shaky. They recognize no faults in the market and have no commitment to the system's stability, as attested by the repeated and intensifying periods of financial crises since the neoliberal era began. In essence, neoliberalism was the vehicle of capital's return to supremacy and a weapon for its continued class domination.